and then of course you record your specific gravities to know where you're at.
You don't actually get to choose or dial up the sugar from the grain, do you? You just get what you get.
You get what you get.
But you could add water later to water it down, right?
Right.
Yep.
So in that regard, I don't see it as being much different to working with fruit juice. Then you've got what you've got, and you want to make it what you want to make it. So what I've done in the past, the only time I ever did a side by side on this kind of thing was with some particularly bad Shiraz grapes one year that were very, very high sugar and not much acidity, and everyone was having trouble making decent wine. So I decided to make a piment out of it. And I dosed one up, got an 18% heavy Shiraz that was sweet, and it was delightful. It was very fresh and wonderful. But as he said, that's a very high ABV, and it was also high sweetness. So for the other one, all I did was I measured the Beaume of the gravity of the fruit juice from the grapes, and then I mixed the honey to the same gravity, and then I just mixed them up 50-50, and it came out as a dry Shiraz style with honey notes.
Okay. AJ, do you have something? How do you do yours?
Yeah, the couple of times I've done braggots, I haven't really done a lot with grain extraction. I just did that with some caramel malt for the extra flavor from that. But when I've used malt extract, I just essentially same ideal as diluting it so that it's the specific gravity I want. I work by specific gravity, and it was exactly the same as when I was doing fruit wines, like Hamish said. You figure out what you got from the fruit and then add honey to adjust to it. And if you've got, I would add about, I'd add a kilogram of malt extract and a kilogram of honey and call it good enough, and dilute it until it was the specific gravity I wanted.
Okay. Hey, Hamish, go over and look at the live chat. Joe's trying to show you something. So many windows, so little time.
Yeah, and it was scrolling again.
Yeah, I know. Okay, so that's what we got on that. Josh, and we'll be doing a show on braggots at some point, and we'll bring in a braggot expert who can delve deeper into this thing. I don't know, Ryan, I don't know if you were thinking we could do something maybe along the lines of modern mead making varietal style-wise.
Sure, I was thinking maybe at some point we could go into the MJCP stuff and look at the different categories and invite different people to speak each on a different category that they're well versed in.
Okay, cool. Yeah, we'll definitely do that then. So the next one is a Melomel question from Joe Abruzzo. How do you determine the volumes of fruit concentrate to honey to get your proper Brix and flavor profile? And the Brix is easy enough because you can just punch that into a calculator, but the flavor profile is another thing. So how do you get it so that you're not going, oh crap, I got the right flavor profile, but that's like a 1.25.
Well, oftentimes what I do is I look at what the suggestions are for making a fruit wine with whatever fruit it is and use however many pounds per gallon of fruit that's suggested for the given fruit. And that way you work on your flavor, and then that's a good guideline for flavor, and then adjust your specific gravity to whatever it is you want.
So I know a friend of mine lives here in Denver. He's actually won more Mazer Cup awards than anybody else in the competition. And we're going to have him on as a guest at some point. One of the things that he taught me, particularly in regards to making piments, I used to buy wine kits, and then I would whip them up and then add as much honey as I thought my yeast might have an opportunity to survive by, and then let it rip. And one of the things that David taught me was that if you were to water down your grape concentrate, and this would also work with Mel's, it allows for the honey to take a bigger part in the show. In other words, it creates some space by watering down the really strong grape concentrates, and David's won countless awards for his Pymans. And if anybody's ever been fortunate enough to have them, you can really tell that there's a wonderful honey representation as well as the particular style of grape, the varietal of grape. And if you were to make a Pyman with just the concentrate watered down to the 6 gallons that typically make a wine kit, it's so fruity that it kind of stomps on your honey quite a bit, I think. So not sure if that helps. I hope it does.
Anybody else have anything to add on that one? Okie dokie. Then we'll move on to Glenn Stevens' question. Glenn was asking, some of the recommended protocols say to stir the must every 12 hours in the first few days to drive off excess CO2 during fermentation to achieve a cleaner product. Does this mean that yeasts are inhibited by the CO2 that gets dissolved in the must? If so, would additional agitation be beneficial?
Absolutely. Just take a look at any of the information on stir plates on Gottmead, and you'll see the results. We were talking about this last week about how agitation really helps everything.
I think I got to buy a stir plate.
And you're not even necessarily adding oxygen, but you're removing the CO2 just by stirring and that motion like a.
Yeah, well, and
you're also stopping the yeast from caking, so you're increasing the surface area of the yeast to the alcohol, keeping it all mixed up all the time. You're getting a better result from that too. The yeast are less likely to go to sleep in the cake at the bottom before they're ready.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's pretty much a win-win.
Yeah.
I was surprised to find out from chatting on Facebook a week or two ago on a wine page, actually. And then I took a question to the Mead Makers Facebook page. I was taught that we're to keep the yeast suspended at all times through the entirety of the fermentation, and I was surprised to find that that's not in other words, not 100% of the mead makers out there do that, and that was a surprise to me. I thought that just as a standard practice, we were to keep our yeast in suspension at all times.
Oh no, we're all about clear as possible.
See, and I think by allowing and we talked about this last week, I believe that by allowing the yeast to pile up on top of each other, that makes a great invitation to start having reductive issues, and therefore that's why I choose to keep them in suspension the entire time until I'm ready to rack.
Yeah, I do it different ways. I have like 28 batches going at a time. Now, some of those are long-term aging, so they don't count, but I have multiple batches that are at different stages. And, ideally I want to stir that at least once a day. If I'm around, I'll stir it more than that. But then as you get towards later in fermentation, then you have to kind of decide, are you going to keep it on the lees longer, like Sir Lee's aging or whatnot, or do you want to just get that off of there? And, I do it different ways depending on what style of mead I'm trying to do. Sometimes I really like those components from the lees, and I will leave it on the fine lees, not the gross lees. Obviously, you have a lot of gunk down there. You need to eventually get that off. Mm-hmm. But some of my meats where I don't really want that, I want to make some of those crisp, fresh, fruity flavors. Once the active fermentation is over and there's not much going on, then I'm going to try to get it off of there, and I'm just going to leave it to let it settle out. And then rack it if I need to get it off of there, so that you don't have to worry about the sulfite compounds developing. So I do it many different ways depending on whatever style I'm making at that particular moment, and then if I remember.
Yeah. There's that whole if I remember thing. Yeah, I got in the habit of I'd get up and make breakfast, and while I was making breakfast, I'd whiz up the mead, and if needed, pitch any additional nutrients and close it up, get my breakfast, and go. And then I'd do the same thing while I was making dinner, and that was the only way I could remember.
It was a lot easier to remember back when I was making mead in the kitchen. Now that it's in the basement, I got to go down 2 flights of stairs.
Yeah, that's
right. So it's a lot.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a lot more difficult to remember to actually do stuff. I'm lucky to get my staggered nutrient stuff.
Yeah, that's where I'm going to be this winter. Is I've got a table I'm setting up and I'm lining up a whole bunch of 2-gallon pails, and I'm going to be doing like 10 different batches at once. And yeah, it's going to be set an alarm on my phone so it gets annoying at me. Otherwise, I'll forget.
Yeah, my most recent mead has been in cold crash for about 8 days now. Like it just needs to be sulfited and racked off. It's actually really good that we're talking about it because I'm right up to that stage, and I've left it sitting for 8 days because it's downstairs in the fridge.
Yeah, Joe was just saying out of sight, out of mind. So true, Joe. Okay, so all right, this was, and I forgot to write down who gave us this question, and I apologize to whoever's question this is. Asked, the added oxygen is all used by the yeast in the first 2 hours after oxygenization. I never can say that. But it's recommended to do a second oxygen addition after 12 hours. Why not every 2 hours for the first little while? And that, I think, goes back to our whole,
Really no good reason not to.
Yeah.
Well, so I could address that, and I imagine Tom probably has some other ideas as well. One of the reasons, and I believe that I said last week, when I'm doing mine, I will oxygenate right prior to pitch, and then I'll try to do it another 12 hours, and then at 24 hours. And the reason that it doesn't really, in my opinion, make sense to oxygenate every 2 or 3 is because one of the things we're trying to do is allow some reproduction to go on. And at the 2-hour mark, this was one of the questions that I brought to the UC Davis staff when I went to the mead making class was how often, in fact, does the yeast produce in a mead must? Because I've read different studies that would tell us different things based on, quote, best case scenario, best living environment, and I think that that's probably at least some different from a mead must environment. And so it doesn't really make sense to continue to oxygenate when you're doing it before there's been at least one budding session or reproduction cycle. And so therefore, that's the reason why that I spread it out over 12-hour periods of time, is so that we're trying to allow for reproduction and then giving the new daughter cells that have come on board oxygen for them to be able to fortify themselves with the sterols and whatnot for the long-term duration later down the road. Tom, what do you have to say about that?
Well, that's a really good question. So, everybody, we should oxygenate pre-pitch. And then I usually do it anywhere from 12 to 24 hours after. But you don't want to do it before that because not much, they're starting to divide and reproduce, but not. And I think the answer to that question is if someone would just do some dissolved oxygen measurements right after they, and to see when does it begin dropping, when do the levels get too low. That could be done in a lab somewhere, and to know when should you begin oxygenating. Adding small amounts frequently after that makes a lot of sense, but I don't have a lot of time to be there, every 2 hours, unless somebody could set up some automated system. But even then, you'd have to see would really that be an advantage, giving a little bit frequently versus just one big bolus and putting it in there. And I don't know the answer to that because I don't know if anybody's even done that study, even with wine, putting little amounts after.
That might be a good study to apply for a grant from the AMMA. They're offering grants right now.
I know I saw that research grant, and I'm like, that could be an interesting study for somebody to do. There's a whole bunch of ideas I have.
Right.
And the thing is, just because a study has been done in wine, it doesn't mean that it would apply to mead. We assume that it would, and I'm sure that it would be very similar, but there may be some differences that's specifically to a traditional mead versus a wine.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like last week we were saying that the amount of dissolved oxygen you need for a high gravity mead is more than you can actually put in there with a stir plate. So my take on it is that once the yeast are using that oxygen, if you can't, if you can only get it up to a certain ppm, then you want to be replenishing it just as soon as they're taking it out. So a lot of little injections afterwards would probably be really useful, and not all that hard to automate, honestly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Says the automation engineer.
No,
I don't charge much
to be done.
So I believe that Chris White spoke to that in